Hello, everyone, and welcome to our four-part Racism 101 series with the Racial Unity Team and the Robin Wood Center. Racial Unity Team's mission is to advance relationships among people of different racial identities, increasing understanding and reducing bias in our community. The Robin Wood Center's mission is to foster opportunities for dialogue and action on issues of sustainability, justice, healing in the New Hampshire and Maine Seacoast region. With these shared missions, it is a natural collaboration for our organizations to come together to begin the dialogue for anti-racist work within this community. So just want to go over a few Zoom rules for today. We are recording this program so that we can post this event to our webpage for others to view, and also so everyone can follow along, since this is a four-part series if you miss a session. If you would not like your face visible, please turn the video off for your Zoom. We will say in the breakout rooms, it is helpful to show your video if you can for breakout work. Please make sure your mics are muted during this discussion. Please be mindful of others, as there's a large amount of individuals on the chat and background noise will interrupt the speaker. If you must leave early, please feel free to do so without interrupting the panel. And we ask that you use the chat area for questions, and they will be addressed throughout the night. When this program was being developed, there was just so much information that we wanted to share with the community. But we quickly realized that this conversation was so multifaceted that it needed to be more than one night. But one of the main questions we want you to think about tonight is, why are you here? We are here because we live in a very white dominated area. And in order to create and impact change, we must understand the basics of racism and how we contribute to it. Meaning, how we contribute to it on an interpersonal level and directly amongst each other through bias, stereotypes, and judgment. We want to hear from you why you are here, so please feel free to put your responses in the chat. So I'd like to introduce our facilitators for this program. Sophie Saltonstall is the founder and board chair of the Robin Wood Center, and Mariam Levy, and I probably said it wrong again, I'm sorry, who is a restorative justice practitioner. So I'm going to turn it over to these two wonderful ladies for the night. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Tanisha. So I'm so excited to dive in tonight. And I think before we do, I just want to take a moment to kind of ground ourselves. We've all had busy days, we all have busy lives. In particular, when we're talking about race and racial justice work, it can bring up a lot for us. So I thought it would be nice before we get going if we just take a couple of breaths here together and kind of maybe close your eyes and feel yourself in your chair. Feel your feet on the ground. Just take a couple of deep breaths. Great, thank you all. So as Tanisha said, my name is Sophie. I'm one of the co-facilitators for this four-part series. We just want to kind of ground ourselves in why we're here tonight, why it's important to do this work. And I think for myself, I just want to share that, I'm here, I'm a white person, and often white folks really look to people of color to do kind of instruction on how to do racial justice work, or what to do. And that really puts a lot of pressure on people of color who are experiencing oppression to also be teachers to white folks. And so we think it's really important for white folks to show up and to help each other do this work together. It doesn't mean we're experts. We got a lot of help in doing this work. We're still learning all the time. We mess up all the time. I mess up all the time. And so we want to be here, Mariam and I want to be here as examples for all of you, and to really come at this as like a learning together kind of thing. We're definitely not, as I said, we're not experts in this. So yeah, we just want to open it up. And Mariam, do you want to say a few words about why you're here also?
Hey everyone, I'm Mariam. It's great to see you all, some familiar faces. Yeah, I just want to say the same sort of thing. I'm here because this is a topic that I really care about. I have done a lot of work in Boston and Chelsea and Lowell, and I think I have struggled a little bit for a while about what does it mean to be a white person in New Hampshire who cares about this. Do I even really care about this if I live in such a white place as New Hampshire? So I think that I've kind of struggled myself with what does it mean to do this work here? And I just want to say again, like Sophie said, I don't consider myself an expert. I know I am learning all the time. I feel like one thing find so compelling about this work is that you never get it all the way. There's just layers and layers and layers to unwrap and understand. And so I think I find myself, as soon as I think I understand something, there's another layer that comes underneath it. And I thought I knew that and I really didn't get it. So just to be, again, clear that I don't consider myself an expert. I consider myself someone who has invested a lot of time and energy in thinking and trying to understand this dynamic and my role in it. I also want to say, like Sophie was saying, that we are two white people who are today leading this conversation. And I just also want to be clear that part of what we feel like it's somewhat our responsibility to be doing some of the learning work with other white people, but also to be clear that we have done a lot of work to make sure with partners of people of color, specifically Black voices, to look this over multiple times and say, did we get it right? What else are we missing? Is there something else we need to say here? So we're not like going out on our own with this. We're really trying to be in direct accountability and in conversation with the people who this issue affects much more than it affects us, to make sure that the way that we're doing this feels responsible to them and feels like it's coming from the right place. So just to be transparent about that.
Awesome. So let's just do a quick overview of what we're going to do today. We're going to go over our goals for the whole 4-part series. We're going to go over kind of orientation and guidelines as we're getting into this work and diving into it. What are some things that we can keep in mind? You know, what are ways that we can show up to this work that will be beneficial? Then we're going to dive into definitions. So I'm really excited to go into definitions because I think if we're going to have a conversation about race, we all need to have kind of a basic understanding of different terms that mean similar things. We have a similar understanding of what we're talking about when we say white supremacy or when we say tokenism. We want to be able to have kind of a basic shared understanding of what those words mean. So we're going to do breakout groups. So hopefully you're in a position where you'll be able to join a breakout group with your video. So heads up, if you need to put on a shirt or, you know, like comb your hair or check if you don't have any food in your teeth, now is the time to do that because hopefully we'll be able to do some breakout group work. And then we're going to go over the definitions together in a full group of kind of what, you know, Mariam and Tanisha and I have thought through. Here's kind of our offering of where we're coming from when we think of these definitions. And then if we have time, we'll do questions and then we'll wrap up and close. So if there are any questions in the meantime, feel free to put them in the chat box as we go along. We'll get to them as we can and as best as we can, but we do have a lot to cover tonight and we're excited to dive in with all of you. So let's dive on in. So Mariam, yeah, can we start the slideshow?
Yeah, and I just wanted to say too that we, like Sophie was saying before, Tanisha, we had so many things when we first started to think about this program. We thought about so much that we wanted to cover. There's so much to talk about. And then we realized, like we said, it needs to not be one program. Even the first beginning of this needs to be 4 different parts. So we are really going to take today to just look again at like definitions, a little bit of like guidelines. How do we want to have this conversation? So we're going to try to give ourselves a little space and time to dig into these basic things first before we even dive into the next thing. So I am going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. And let's see if we can.
Awesome. And while Mariam is doing that, this is just a reminder that you have the ability, if you're on a computer, probably not if you're on a phone or iPad, but you can slide. There are two little bars in between the slideshow and where all of our pictures are, and you can adjust the size. So if you want to see more people, you can slide it over. So just an FYI, that was a little trick I learned the other day that I thought I would pass on.
So yeah, here's just to see it written out, what the 4 parts of this series are going to be, that we decided we kind of needed to stretch this out and give each of these pieces a little bit more time to dig in together. So today is the definitions and orientation. Next Wednesday, we're talking a little bit more about systemic racism, cultural and institutional racism. We're looking at more big picture ways that this shows up, both in our sort of national scale, but also in terms of universities or schools or workplaces. And then program 3, we're skipping the next week because that's election week. So we're going to give ourselves all a little breathing room that week. And then we're coming back for personal and interpersonal racism. So we're looking more at sort of what are our own internal ways we think about this and process issues around race, what might be showing up there. And then also, how does that come out in our relationships and interpersonally? And then program 4 at the end is really like, how does this show up for us? What is our role? Like we talked about, what does this mean for a white person living in New Hampshire? What do we do with this? What's action we can take? What's processing we need to do? Where do we fit into all of this? And where do we kind of go from here?
Awesome. So I just want to go over the goals for the 4-part series. This is when Mariam and I were thinking about starting this program. We were like, okay, well, how do we even think about doing a Racism 101 program? Like let's start with what we want people to get out of it, because I think that will help us inform, how to build the program. So these are the goals that we came up with. We think to really get started in this work, it's helpful to have common language with terms and definitions. As I said earlier, that's just so we all have a shared basic understanding of the words that we're using when we talk about race. We want to have a basic understanding of 4 levels of racism and what they look like. And as Mariam said, we want this to be really relevant to our lives in New Hampshire. So we're going to look to New Hampshire for some examples and observations. We want to have a basic understanding of whiteness and how it shows up in our lives. I think this is a really important piece because whiteness is often invisible, or it's the norm and we don't talk about it. And I know for myself, I didn't even identify or think about myself as a white person until I was in my late 20s. It had never really occurred to me to think about the color of my skin in a more critical way. And we also want to do an orientation of where New Hampshire residents fit into this and what we can do. It's really overwhelming to realize the depth of racism and how it shows up in our society. So we want to give you some next steps and resources to keep working on it. So then resources is the other one. So when you're done with this 4-part series, what can you do? Where can you look to? It is a really overwhelming space. So we try to, kind of pick the best things that we think are the best to kind of help you along that journey. And we'll provide, further reading for a lot of the topics we cover. So we really want you to walk away from this with, a feeling that you know where to go from here. You can take a next step.
So we also kept the name Racism 101 for all 4 of them, because we also realized that even when you've gone through all 4 of them, we all have a lot more to learn and a lot more to go. So there's no sense of, okay, we did that and now that's done. So we have to, we also wanted to make sure that the goal is not to leave this and feel like, okay, I've learned everything I need to know. Check that box. Okay, and so in order to go ahead and get us started here, we're going to look, I guess before we do that, we're going to talk a little bit to start about some guidelines for effective cross-cultural communication. And these come from an organization called Visions, Inc., who has done some training and work with, I know, like the Exeter School Board. I'm on the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Justice Committee for the Exeter Elementary Schools. So I got to go through some of their training. And so I think this is important because we do not, I know for myself, I was not raised having really nuanced or productive or informed conversations about race. This was not something that we talked about. When the way I grew up was, I was in a pretty religious household, and it was everyone's the same under God. And so we don't need to discuss any further than that about how we might be different or maybe experiencing the world really differently. And so we thought it was important to start with a little sense of like, how do we try to approach this conversation? We haven't been maybe taught the skills to be able to do this well. And so let's start with some guidelines for ourselves that we can use both internally and as we're talking about these things. So please keep these in mind as you're in your small groups, but also as you read and as you take in new information around race and these dynamics and histories and people's personal experiences with it. How do we stay within a productive way of doing this? And so these are some guidelines, again, from Visions, Inc., that I thought it would be helpful to go through before we begin this 4-part series. So the first one is, number one is try on. So this is sort of an invitation to sort of be open-minded to others' ideas, worldviews, maybe even their personal stories or experiences. I know, like, one example of this might be, I know there was a Black woman who lives here in Exeter who was at a restaurant downtown, and she was there with a bunch of other people, and she noticed that the server came and took everybody's order except hers, like twice. And so she said, like, looked around and said, hold on, I think something's going on here. And the first thing that somebody next to her said was, don't make this about race. Don't make this a racial thing. And so I think sometimes, especially when we haven't, as white people, have not had those same experiences, it's easy for us to kind of shut that down and not try on, like, oh, maybe that is about race. What would it be to like let that in? What would that experience be like to always have that be your experience around race? And so this idea of being able to not have this immediate defense of like, oh, don't go there or don't talk about that. But what if we could try on? Maybe it is. And what would that mean? And how might the story be different if that were true? So that one's just really an invitation to see what feels like it might be true, even if at first listen, it feels hard for you to understand. The second one is about it's okay to not agree. And so sometimes we're going to think differently about these things, and maybe disagreements are not always a problem, but could actually be a window for us to help us see where we're not understanding or hearing each other. I think it's okay to like not agree right away and be able to try to create more understanding. And like it said at the beginning, we can disagree and maybe still stay connected and be able to keep doing the work. I think one thing I want to add to this that's not really written here, but I think is important, is that like sometimes people disagree about even how to do this work. I led a group this past summer of white people who were looking at dynamics around race, and we chose to use the White Fragility book by Robin DiAngelo. And there were definitely lots of things written at the time and concerns about like, why are you reading a white author when you're talking about race? Why are you centering this white voice? And then there were a bunch of other people and people of color who I was working with who said, no, actually, this really is an important place to start. This is an important voice. It's not the only voice, but it is actually a productive place to start. So sometimes we don't even agree about how to do this. But and sometimes I think as white people, especially, we feel like, just tell me what to do. There's got to be a right way to do this. There's a right answer. Just tell me what it is. And I think it's okay to know that, like, not all Black people are going to agree about how to do this. Like, we're going to have to do a little struggling ourselves about what feels right and how to do this in a good way. That being said, I think it's also true that it's okay to not agree, but maybe also recognizing where, if you're coming from a white perspective, there may be a lot that you don't understand as well. And so maybe being really careful about when you are not in agreement with a person of color, especially if they're talking about their own experience, that maybe you need to also kind of step back a little bit and do a little bit more listening. So it's okay to not agree, but it's also important to recognize as a white person that your perspective and your experience and your frame of reference may be very limited about this. And you may need to do a little bit more listening, especially to Black, Indigenous, people of color voices around this. So the next one is, this one's a hard one. It's not okay to blame, shame, or attack self or others. So this can be a hard one for ourselves. I know sometimes when I mess up or there's something that I think back on what I did that I now realize was so insensitive, it's easy to kind of shame myself or attack myself and say, oh, I can't believe I was that stupid. Or I can't believe I didn't know that. It's really easy to get really angry at other people who haven't explored this topic and who I feel like are really on the wrong side of this conversation. And it's hard to not blame, shame, or attack them as well. We're going to talk a little bit more about maybe ways that we can use ourselves to have those conversations. So the next one is this practice self-focus. So again, it's sort of focusing, that's sort of that same one of what maybe focus on I statements. So instead of trying to feel like you need to represent a whole huge experience of either all white people or whatever it is, that you can just talk about yourself. And that way the accountability lies with yourself as well. So you're not saying we all need to, because that can be sort of vague or broad, like what are you responsible for is actually yourself. And so if you can stay in that frame, then you're able to know like, okay, I can be accountable to that because I'm saying I need to do this. I need to do this differently. I need to learn more. I need to think this way. I think the other piece about this that's really important is that, again, we've all been on this, we're all on this journey. And so I think sometimes if we can practice self-focus around being vulnerable about the things that we used to not understand or the things that we still don't understand, that helps to build people's ability to listen to you as opposed to, again, blaming or shaming them that they don't understand something that you feel like you now understand. So that also that sense of like your own journey and your own vulnerability and your own learning is actually a more powerful tool for communicating than telling people or feeling like you have the right answer now. The next one is about notice both the process and the content. So for example, notice who's active and who's not in a conversation, who's comfortable and who's not. So I think like if you think of an example of maybe someone who's running a business or a school and who decides, I really want to know, I'm really curious about the racial dynamics in my workplace, but maybe there's only 1 or 2 Black people who work here. And maybe in front of a bunch of other people at a meeting, you ask them, hey, how do you feel about the racial climate at our place of work? And maybe the content of what you're asking is actually a really important question, but the process that you're using to ask that question could actually be really damaging and harming and alienating because that person might not feel comfortable in this big group being put on the spot to have that conversation. So again, like the content of that question may not be wrong, but the way you're doing it is actually really harmful. So really thinking about both process and content as we do this. So both how we say something and why we say something and not just what. Another really important one I think is this practice both and thinking. So we can see that there's a lot of tensions in this work and that things can be true at the same time, which I think is really hard sometimes. I think sometimes we, as a white person, I have struggled sometimes with like feeling this sort of shame or guilt or really being weighed down with like, it's my fault that I have racist ideas or that I'm part of this racist system. And then, you know, that may be true. And I have a responsibility to do something different about it. So I can hold both of those things at the same time, like both, you know, I do play a role in this system. I am part of this. There are advantages I get from being white. And at the same time, I also have a responsibility to try to do something different. So it's not just either I'm this or I'm that, but there may be both of these things that need to exist at the same time. And there's 2 more, and one is to be aware of both the intent and the impact of your actions. I think this one is really important. I think sometimes I'll stay still focused. I can assume that because my intentions are so good about what I'm trying to do or say, that must mean I can't be at fault or I can't be held accountable for the fact that it may actually be harmful what I'm saying. So I know I had an example when I was in high school. I all of a sudden got really fired up about racial justice issues. I hadn't even thought about this before. I was reading some things. I got all excited. And there was a student a friend of mine who was a Black student in my school who I hadn't had these conversations about before. And I just like came at her all of a sudden, like all fired up, like, what are we doing? What are you doing? How have you even been like dealing with this whole time? And I just came with all this energy, like expecting her to have these answers and expecting her to like be all fired up and ready to do something. And I think my intention in that moment was, I really wanted to make a change and I wanted to notice this. I think the impact was really awful for her, that she was like, hey, this is so obnoxious that you're first noticing this and you're bringing all of your own very white-centered energy to me and having no idea or a concept of how this might be affecting me, that you're all of a sudden bringing this all up and expecting me to have answers for you and expecting me to take the lead here. So I think that's an example of how sometimes we feel like we're really doing the right thing, and it can feel so hurtful and so hard when somebody points out, you may have thought you were doing the right thing, but that actually was really harmful. And then I know I can feel sort of cut off at the knees. And instead of hearing that as really important feedback, can feel like, well, never mind. It's easier to just not do anything. And so how do we be cognizant and responsible for the impact, even when our intentions may have been really good? And the last one is confidentiality. So I think, again, how do we, if there's something that we hear, maybe in this conversation or just in general, how are we using our courage to sort of bring that to the person if you need to give feedback, as opposed to talking to other people about it? How do we be brave enough to have these conversations with each other instead of kind of going outside, talking to someone else about it? So those are these guidelines that I hopefully will help us today and forever. They're ones that take a lot of practice and work. I'm not good at them all yet either. Sophie, do you want to tell us a little bit about maybe any experience you've had with these?
Sure. Yeah, I just think they're so important and so helpful. I think for myself, I was so scared to talk about race for most of my life that I refused to do it. I just felt too anxious that I would say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing. And so I didn't talk about it at all. I didn't engage in it. And it's only been in the last maybe 10 years or so that I started challenging myself on that and taking some steps forward, and taking risks and being willing to let go of my ego a little bit. And, when I mess up, just apologize and move on. We don't have to blame or shame ourselves to the point where we don't engage in this work, because that's not very helpful either. So I want to share a story about a time, this was kind of in the beginning of my racial justice journey and learning about it, where I was a climate change organizer in Boston. And for those of you who know Boston, it's a very segregated city. So I was in kind of one of the whiter parts of town. I was in kind of the Somerville, Cambridge area. And we were having a climate change discussion and meeting, and it was all white folks who were there. It was white led. There were only white folks there. And I remember thinking like, I wonder why there aren't more people of color here. Like, climate change definitely impacts people of color. Like, why isn't anybody here? And I remember thinking that, and it's embarrassing to even say that out loud now. But my assumption was that people of color should come to the white-led climate change work instead of challenging myself to go to a different part of town where there were people of color who were engaging in this work and were leading on this work. But I assumed that the white-led space was, the one that people should go to, instead of challenging myself to go to the people of color-led climate change work and asking how I could be helpful there. So at that time, I was unaware of the guidelines, and kind of in retrospect, I've been able to think back to that moment and think about maybe, where I kind of had a misstep or missteps in that line of thinking. So just want to kind of highlight a couple of where the guidelines come into that. I wasn't very aware of impact versus intention. So my intention was that it should be, climate change should be a space for everybody, and that, we should have a diverse environment when talking about climate change. But the impact was that I was prioritizing white-led climate change work. So there's a difference there. And kind of similar, like process and content was a little bit off too. So the content was relevant, like how can we be a more diverse group and how can we accomplish this work together? But the content was not thought through all the way. I wasn't aware of how, me showing up in a certain space, what that meant, or, what my assumptions were about different organizing work across town. And I didn't think through, who wasn't in the room and why weren't they in the room. So it's really uncomfortable to admit when we've made a mistake and to take responsibility for that. And I think it's really important to model being vulnerable, especially for other white folks. You will mess up in this work. And I hope that, I think as white people can try and hold each other gently as we can, while also, really holding that responsibility, because it's okay to make mistakes, but if we're making those same mistakes over and over, that's maybe a different thing. And we need to learn from them, and we need to move forward collectively and together. But it's not helpful to kind of attack people for, where they're at in the journey. My friend Toyin pointed out that, in this example, I invited myself to kind of reflect and challenge myself on how I could have done things differently. And sometimes, you'll do that privately in your own thinking, and retrospect, you could have done things differently. And sometimes other people will challenge you, and both are uncomfortable and both are necessary for moving this work forward. So just wanted to share that. Mariam, anything to add?
Yeah, I think just one more thing is that sometimes I think it can feel really awkward to point out something like that to another white person, another friend, because it feels like it sort of interrupts this feeling of, it's just awkward. It's awkward to say, it's awkward to know how to do. And I think for me, it feels like one of the big things we can do in New Hampshire is interrupt when we hear and see things like that in a way that, again, is really humble and kind and generous, but that is also not allowing people to stay right where they are in their journey and kind of helping them move along as well.
Mariam, maybe we can add that to our, part 4 of this program. So, if you're interested in learning how to practice those skills, I think we can try and incorporate that, because I think that'd be really helpful.
Yes. So I'm going to ask you all now to just take a minute I've just written them all, sort of a little blurb from each of those guidelines here on this slide. And I'd ask you all to just take 1 minute, and I want you to really think about for a minute. Think about like a time that you felt discomfort around race, whether it's sort of in your own thinking or in a conversation with someone else. And maybe think about, are there any of these guidelines that really could be helpful for you in your own thinking or in future conversations about race? Where do you notice that maybe you get stuck and one of these could actually be really useful to you? And what we're hoping to do is, after you take a minute and think about that, we're going to split you into a quick pair share. Just take a few minutes and share that with just one other person on this call. And then we'll come back, and we're not going to necessarily share those all out. We're going to jump into definitions. So you don't have to share your story with everyone, but just give you a little chance to reflect and check in with one other person about how you make sense of these and where you think, if there's one of these that might be helpful for you in your thinking. Well, I hope that just those few minutes, that was useful. We're hoping to, there's a lot of information, but we're also hoping to help you have a little chance to work with it a little bit and see what makes sense here, what makes sense to me. How do I stop for a minute and process, because there's a lot that we're talking through. So I appreciate you all doing that. And I hope that as we continue these conversations today, we're going to do another small group exercise. And as we keep going in this series, that we feel free to remind ourselves of these guidelines and remind each other if we need to. I think they're good. They're good guiding posts for us. So thanks for being part of that with us. Sophie, do you want me to go ahead and share my screen again?
Sure, that would be great.
Let me do that.
So we are going to dive into definitions, and to do that, we're going to do some small breakout groups again. Before we get there, just a little bit of context. So again, as I said in the beginning, we think it's really important that we're all on the same page about some definitions. There are so many definitions that we could have chosen to focus on for this evening. And it was really hard to narrow it down and to just pick a few so it wasn't too overwhelming. So we ended up picking just 8 definitions that we're going to look at together. And some of these definitions might be familiar to you, some might be new to you, and that's totally fine. We invite you to try them on. And if they're new to you, that's totally fine. If they're familiar, and somebody else has a different experience or view of that, try on, looking at it from their perspective too. So we all want to kind of have a shared understanding of what these terms mean. So we're going to break you up into groups of 3 to have this discussion for 15 minutes. We're only going to ask you in your small groups to kind of think through definitions of 2 of the terms. If you get through the 2 terms in 5 minutes and you're all on the same page and you have nothing else to talk about, feel free to move on to another one of them. But my hunch is that it will take you all 15 minutes to just kind of have a decent conversation about just 2 of them. And then after the 15 minutes, we'll come back as a full group, and we're interested in hearing from a few folks, any aha moments you had or anything you learned or anything that was kind of exciting for you. We're not going to be able to go around and kind of share all of our definitions and what we came up with, but really we're looking for those kind of key takeaways. So in your small groups, when you get in them, assign one person to kind of take some notes, and if one person is interested or able to kind of do a report back, that would be helpful with just like 1 or 2 key takeaways that you had in your small groups. We also are interested in having you discuss any emotions that come up for you around any word. Do you feel anger? Do you feel fear? Do you feel tension? Do you feel resistance to particular words? And just kind of notice that, be aware of that. And if you feel comfortable, you can share that with your group around what those words are bringing up for you. So you're going to want to, once you get into your groups, you're going to kind of quickly want to figure out which 2 terms you want to focus on. You could probably spend all 10 minutes arguing about which terms you want to discuss, but our hope is that you'll kind of quickly be like, okay, let's just focus on these 2, and then have the discussion for the rest of your time. So to kind of help you prepare for that, we're going to give you just 30 seconds to look at the definitions and write down the 2 that you feel most interested, or the few that you feel most interested in diving into. And so Mariam, can you go ahead and advance the slide? So the terms are white privilege, white supremacy, racism, POC/BIPOC, and why there's a distinction between the 2, equity, collective liberation, and tokenism. So those are the terms. Just take a few minutes here, well, not even a few minutes, the next 10 seconds to write down or kind of think about which terms that you would be excited to dive into and kind of, have a discussion in your small groups with. And then Tanisha, if you are available to put people back into small groups, that would be great. So I'm going to put that in the directions and the chat box again, so you'll have these terms available. So hopefully you can come into agreement very quickly which terms you want to dive into. And then at the end, we'll kind of discuss any key takeaways or learnings that you had when you were in your groups. Sound good?
Sounds good. You ready?
Yep.
All right, here we go.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a really great discussion. How was that for folks? Can you give me a thumbs up, thumbs sideways? Cool. Well, Mariam and I were trying to think through how to, have this be an interactive series. I think it's hard, and we're all kind of zoomed out probably by now. So hopefully it was nice to have a chance to actually have a real conversation with another human. Great. So we're, running a little bit short on time. We want to make sure we get you guys out of here at 8 or as close to 8 as possible. So we're going to dive right in. I don't think we are going to have time for folks to report back, but if you could take a minute and do any takeaways you had and share them in the chat box. I know I would love to see them, and I'm sure other people would too. So please do share any takeaways you had in the chat box. So we're going to dive right into the definitions as kind of we've thought about them. So Mariam's going to share the slideshow we put together, and we're going to dive right in. So white privilege. I'm curious, can you raise your hand if this was one of the terms that you all chose? Okay, cool. If you at least one group, maybe two groups. So white privilege is the unearned, mostly unacknowledged social advantage white people have over other racial groups simply because they are white. And I just literally took that from dictionary.com. That's not a complicated one. There is a clip that I want to play you from Jane Elliott, who's a white woman and social justice and racial justice practitioner that to me is like so brilliant. It's only 45 seconds long. So Mariam, if you could play that, that would be awesome. And make sure the audio is recorded.
I want every white person in this room who would be happy to be treated as this society in general treats our citizens, our Black citizens. If you, as a white person, would be happy to receive the same treatment that our Black citizens do in this society, please stand. You didn't understand the directions. If you white folks want to be treated the way Blacks are in this society, stand. Nobody's standing here. That says very plainly that you know what's happening. You know you don't want it for you. I want to know why you're so willing to accept it or to allow it to happen for others.
So that's it. That's that quote. It just is such a mic drop moment. You're just like, oh, if I were in that audience, I'd be like, oh man. Whew. So yeah, we'll kind of, sit with that a little bit. If this is the first time you're engaging in this, it might be a little bit triggering or difficult to kind of accept that you have privilege. And I think another really beautiful quote that discusses it is that white privilege doesn't mean that you haven't been oppressed or that you haven't had a difficult life. It just means the reason why your life has been difficult is not because of the color of your skin. And I just want to pause on that because I think that's just such a brilliant and beautiful way of summarizing it. I think a lot of white people struggle with the fact that we do have privilege, especially those of us who have come from different backgrounds. Maybe you don't feel like you've been privileged. You don't feel like you've had, if you've grown up poor in this country and poor and white particularly, it's hard to really understand that you have been privileged in the society. And it's not that you haven't gone through hard things or that you haven't been oppressed. It's that the reason why your life is difficult is not because of the color of your skin. And I think that that's just such a eloquent way of putting it and summarizing it. We're going to dive into this a lot more, especially toward the end of the series when we're thinking about white privilege and how we can use it and how we can, use our privilege to help other white folks, how we can use it to, help everybody, people of color included. Like, what can we do with that privilege? It's a privilege, and it can be put to good use. It doesn't just have to be something that we feel really ashamed of, although we do need to acknowledge it and be aware of it. So there's some further reading if you want to do, we'll put in the chat box. One book that we recommend is called White Fragility, which is really powerful. It's written by a white woman. And there's another article that I have found incredibly helpful for myself called I Racist, which kind of dives into, I think for myself, before I read this article, I was like, I'm not racist, I'm not a racist. I don't have racist ideas and thoughts. And after reading this article, I was like, oh my gosh, like, even though I don't want to be part of this system, I am. There are thoughts and biases that I have that I don't want to acknowledge, I wish weren't true, but that I still hold as a white person. And so even though I don't want to, I still have those very reactionary racist thoughts and feelings that I have to constantly check myself on, because I was raised in this society, as we all were. So, or I'm assuming, maybe some of us were not. So let me put those in the chat box. They're also, we'll send them out. Oh shoot, the link didn't go for the article. I'll have to link that later for you. So we're gonna keep moving. So let's go to the next slide.
And just so you know too, we are going to send these slides to everybody who participated. So if you will have these definitions and these links if sent to you, so you don't necessarily have to write them all down too. So the next one is racism. And I wonder if people try to tackle this one. This is a big one to try to define. This again comes from some of the work at Visions and our friend Toyin, who has done a lot of this work with us. So again, like this idea that you may have heard about racism in all these different ways. And this to me feels really helpful as it breaks down all these different levels that it shows up. Sometimes in the same interaction, all of these things might be showing up. So we're looking at the personal level. So the internal bias, Sophie was just talking about this. What does it mean that we just sometimes have these reactions and thoughts immediately about things that have been conditioned in us around race? So again, that like people of color have certain qualities that such as assuming a person of color is maybe less educated than a white person. What are the things that we just sort of instantly assume? Like when you look at some of the studies that have been done about Airbnb, people who try to go onto Airbnb, or people who try to apply for jobs, or people who apply for housing, and just the name, all we do in these studies is switch the name, and the name either sounds very like an African-American name or it sounds like a white name. And the difference in response just based on that different name is substantial in these studies. So to look at like, what are the assumptions internally that we're making when we associate someone with a certain race? And that's just sort of our internal process. So, and then interpersonal. So again, it comes out in our interactions with people. So we put a couple of little quotations here of like, oh, you're so articulate, might be a comment that somebody might make because your personal bias is that a Black person would not be articulate. And so this becomes such a surprise to you that you need to point that out to someone. And this becomes an interpersonal thing because now this other person is recognizing that, oh, you thought that I wasn't articulate because I was Black. And so now you think you're giving me this compliment, but actually you're giving yourself away about what you really made a lot of assumptions about me beforehand. Or again, you hear about this, like so many comments that about affirmative action. Oh, you just got into Harvard because of affirmative action. So that's another way that this is interpersonal. Now someone else is experiencing my own biases and can hear them in what I'm saying to them. And that's what we might call these sort of microaggressions. So, and then there's also name calling. I mean, there's people using the N-word. There's very blatant interpersonal racism. And so I think sometimes, I know in the past for me, I have seen that as like, oh, that's what racism is when somebody uses the N-word about somebody else. And that's sort of what to us feels like the most obvious. And I think it's also easy for me to then say, oh, I don't do that. I would never do that. I would never call somebody that. And so therefore I must be outside of this dynamic of racism. Sometimes that seems like the most, like it says here, it's the one we can most easily externally observe in someone else. And we know that's not okay, but it also shows up sometimes in these other examples that are sort of more the microaggressions that are tipping our hand about what we really are thinking inside, but we don't really even know necessarily that that's making that really obvious to people around us. So that's that interpersonal level. And then we're looking at a cultural level. So again, like the messages we all receive about skin color, the messages we receive about who's normal, who's valuable, who's right. That if we look at all of these messages we receive from when we're little, the books we're reading, the TV shows. I was watching movies with my kids recently, and I just could not believe how in every single movie we watched, when there was a character that was a person of color, their entire purpose in the movie was to take care of and attend to the needs of the white people in the movie. It was like every single one. So my kids are getting this message over and over and over again: who's valuable, who's at the top here, and who else needs to be just taking care of their needs. So I think this kind of, both we get these cultural messages constantly, and then we look at our we look at sort of the culture of our workplace, or we look at the culture, like whose hair is considered professional and whose hair is not considered professional. And that becomes sort of that starts to be sort of a culture, or how is communication considered professional or not professional? There's lots of ways that like a certain culture, it becomes the norm, and anybody who's outside of that is either not valued or is unprofessional or is all kinds of things that we will label that. So then the next piece goes into that institutional piece. So we're looking at laws, hiring practices, again, company policies. Maybe this is where the cultural leaks into a policy where you're not allowed to wear braids in your hair. And that becomes actually a company policy, that the way your hair is not okay and not normal and not professional. So we're looking at college admission practices. We're looking at hiring practices. We're looking at all of these ways that these other pieces get baked into the actual systems that we're all part of and play a role in. Sophie, I'm going to go to the next one. This is just a nice little graphic that kind of helps us think through these pieces. And actually, as you'll notice, sort of the flow of our 4 sessions is going to be that we're going to look next time at this more institutional and cultural. We're going to take these apart a little bit. And then after that, we're going to look more at the personal and interpersonal. And this is going to help us structure the way we want to have this conversation and learn about this as well.
Great. Yeah, I know this is a lot to go over so quickly. And again, this is why we decided to spread it out over 4 parts so that we can have time to digest and really dive into those 4 levels, because that's so crucial in understanding what racism is in our country. So POC and BIPOC, just notice the difference in how I pronounce that. POC stands for person of color, and that's for really anybody who doesn't identify as white can identify as a person of color. That's generally what is accepted. And then BIPOC is specific to a Black or Indigenous person of color. And I wonder if anybody dove into this into their small group about why there's a distinction. It's a relatively new distinction, and these are relatively new terms that folks are using. And so just to because we're running short on time, I'll just say it. The reason why there's a distinction is because Black and Indigenous people in particular have very distinct histories in this country that are long and continued forms of oppression that are different than other people of color. So a lot of different racial groups have different kinds of oppression, different ways that they've been, cut out of society, or different laws that have excluded them from different benefits that white people have had. But Black and Indigenous people in particular have had centuries of discrimination against them, really intentionally. So that's why there's a distinction between those 2. So again, it's POC, person of color, and then BIPOC is a Black or Indigenous person of color.
So tokenism is maybe something that you've heard talked about. Maybe you heard it talked about with the state education board recently. There was a big thing around that. So I'm not sure. That was an interesting example of this term certainly being thrown around. And so in that case, it was that the accusation was that it was inviting a person of color to a team or workplace for the purpose of appearing diverse, but then not including them in decision-making process or power, or ignoring their feedback in favor of the way things have always been. So it's sort of like we want it to look good, like we're including other voices, but we're not actually interested in changing anything that you may have, that takes into account your perspective or what you may have to say as a minority person on this. You'll see this sometimes when there's like an event that gets planned, and all of it gets planned, how it's going to be run, everything that's going to happen. And then at the last minute, it's like, oh, well, this maybe looks bad, so we're going to invite a person of color to come be part of this event, but they didn't get to plan any of it or determine how things should be done, or their voice was not represented in the planning process. It's just sort of like, we want to show at the end that somehow as if this represents a lot of different experiences, when maybe in the planning and the power of the conversation was not included.
Great. So the next one is white supremacy. And this is a really interesting one because I think kind of the way that term is being used has changed over time. I think it kind of in the past, and for myself, when I would think about white supremacy, just KKK automatically, that's what I would think about. And that's kind of all I would think about. And I'd be like, oh, well, that's kind of a thing of the past, even though clearly it's not. And it's so how we define it is the overall assumption by society that white is better, which is deeply seated in all of us. It's not just the KKK. And white privilege acts on that assumption that white is better. It falls into the category of cultural racism, and it's kind of the assumption that white is the default or the norm or the model, which Mariam referred to briefly just then. Can you go to the next slide?
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
My bad.
So if you Google search, beautiful woman, I Google searched beautiful woman, and this is what my screen showed. It's primarily white women. And that you see this everywhere. And this is what Mariam was saying, in movies, in our culture, in our media. White is kind of the default. And if you want to do something outside of the default, then you have to search for beautiful Black woman. I've done this with the term baby too. Even just the term baby, it was pretty much all white babies. And you have to search for Black baby. The same thing is true for Barbies. Barbie is white, and there's a Black Barbie, but it's specifically labeled as Black Barbie. So anything that's not white has to have something in front of it that says like, hey, this is something that's different. This is not the norm. And we see that kind of everywhere in society. And I was unaware of that for most of my life. And once I started noticing it, it's impossible to not see everywhere. So just notice that. And as you're experiencing the world, as you're watching your TV shows, who's in there? Who are the main characters? Who's the lead in the role? Who's the main person in the show that you're watching? And I'm wondering, why that is. It's because white is the default. So when we talk about white supremacy, that's what we're talking about. It's not just the white supremacist groups that we hear about more in the media today. It's just this overall assumption by society that white is better and the norm.
And Toni Morrison talks about how like white is normal and everyone else has to be hyphenated. So like if you're, as an American, white is American, and if you're not white, then you get to be hyphenated. Another thing that's a term that kind of gets thrown around a lot that might be a little bit newer for some people is this idea of equity. Sometimes people assume that equity and equality would be the same thing. Having everybody get the same thing should mean that we're have equity, when really not everyone has the same needs. And so equity includes what different resources and needs people have in terms of access, support, in order to be able to reach their full potential. So this little graphic here shows, if you have equality and you give everybody the exact same size stool, and they're behind this fence, then not everyone still is able to see in an equal way. Where equity, you get what you need in order to be able to have access to what's happening. And then I love that it's liberation. Like, let's take, why do we have the fence? Like, what is the fence doing for us? Let's take this fence down. So we don't need to have all of these, nobody needs to ask for something extra just to be able to participate and be part of what we're doing. So I know, like, the committee that I'm part of in the Exeter Elementary is the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice Committee. So it's this real idea of what does equity look like in our schools? And it may mean that, especially because of the history and because of all these dynamics we're talking about, that it may mean that it's not equal access or equal time. It's actually, we need to increase time and resources and access for some people because it has been denied for so long.
Great. And this last one I see in the chat box is one that people were curious about. It's my favorite one and the one that we want to end on, which is collective liberation. This is kind of a newer term. So if you haven't heard it before, don't feel badly. It's kind of a newer term, and it's the idea that white people's freedom is tied together with the freedom of all people, specifically people of color. I think often in this work, there can be kind of white saviorism, or like that white people need to give up so much, and that's what allyship looks like, and that's why we're doing this work, is we need to, white people need to be taken down and reduced, when in fact, it's more that we will all be freer if we do this work, and this is for everybody. As a white person, I have stake in this. I'm not doing this work just because I want to be a good person and I want to be, helpful and do charity work. That's not why I'm here. I'm here because it's beneficial to me and it's beneficial for everybody. Lila Watson has a quote: "If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. If you have come because your liberation is bound up in mine, then let us work together." And I think that's a really beautiful way of putting it. One specific example is that I used to live in New York City. And when I was walking on the street at night, if I saw, my heart would beat differently depending on who was on the street with me. If there was another white woman, I would feel relatively comfortable. But if there was a Black man on the street, I would notice my heart would race a little bit faster. And that's a negative impact of racism, bias, and cultural training that I've had over time, that Black men are more dangerous. And so I would have to challenge myself. And not to say that, I would be oblivious to actual situations where I should be careful, because also as a woman, I do need to be careful if I'm on the street alone at night. But, we need to challenge ourselves to kind of our automatic assumptions and reactions when we have them. And I would be freer if I had the same emotional reaction and bias to a white person as a person of color. I would be freer if, everybody in our schools had the same access to education. That would benefit me in our society. And so collective liberation is really that idea that we're all in this together, and we need to act as though we're in it together, and it benefits all of us, not just people of color. Mariam, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think two things. One is, I also think that, I know in my experience of being in relationship with people who are not white, there's just, sometimes there's barriers, there's tension, and to me, it feels so harmful and frustrating that oh man, we have to deal with this bigger issue that clearly we're playing a role in this, and it's really problematic for me that this is something that gets in the way of our relationship or our ability, not that we can't work through it, but it affects me in the ways that I get to be fully human with other people or not. I also think that people have said, well, I just grew up white in New Hampshire, so race never really had anything to do with me. I didn't even know about it. And I think that's also not really true, because when I think about, we live in a society where, as we've talked about, certain people are valued over other people. There's a hierarchy of who's valuable, whether it's education level, whether it is, whether you have an accent, where you're from, it could be body type, gender, race, all these things. And so I think that when we kind of buy into or complicit in one of these hierarchies, because I'm white, so I'm not going to really challenge that, then I get put in my own boxes and I need to stay in my own box, and I'm sort of still feeding into a system of hierarchy where some people are more valuable than others. And first of all, what does that do to like my own humanity, to be complicit in that and feel like, well, that's okay as long as those people are down there? But also, what does it do to me in terms of my own value? If I step out of line, if I step out of these boxes that I need to stay in, that I'm kind of accepting, then yeah, I'm going to be outside of the hierarchy. So to me, it feels like for so many different reasons, we need to dismantle these systems of hierarchy and alternate values, because it's going to actually make me feel like I get to be liberated too, and I get to be like who I want to be in the world, and not feel like I need to stay in some box in order to stay in this hierarchy system. So I think it really does affect us all, whether we're in all white spaces or not.
So I know we're out of time. We're just gonna wrap up here. If you can just give us a couple more minutes, that would be great. Mariam, do you want to do the next slide? And go over the close.
Yeah, so we're just, this was a lot. This was a lot to get into. I'm glad that you all will have these slides so you can read them over. We are really happy to, if you want to ask questions in the chat, then we could try to take up those questions next time. So please, if there's something that you feel like you really don't get, there's a lot of this stuff that also just takes a lot of kind of tumbling over in yourself and thinking through. So there may be things that actually just require a little bit more time to sit with and process too. But if you do have questions, please leave them in the chat and we will try to figure out how to address them in the upcoming series. These are again, the dates that are coming up, program 2, 3, and 4. I hope that you will join us or invite other people. I think it's fine for other people to come for the other ones. If they haven't seen this one, there will be a recording of this one too, so they can catch up that way. Sophie, anything else?
Yeah, just, thank you for showing up, for giving us your time and, being here in this work. As Mariam and I said in the beginning, we're not experts in this. We're learning all the time, and we would love your feedback. So we're going to send out the slides for you to review after, and also a survey. And we would love to hear your feedback on what could be better, what else we can do, what you're looking forward to in future programs. And we will practice being humble and not putting our egos first, not being defensive. So we really do value your feedback and how we can make this a more accessible or better program for everybody. So we really hope you'll come to all 4, because I think all 4 are really important. And the next 3 in particular, we're diving really deep into racism, and at the end, what we can do about it. So there's a lot of kind of jargon in this first one and orientation, and we're going to really get into the meat of it in the next series. So please do come back and encourage your friends and family to join us as well.
And I know like we're happy to hang out a little bit too. I know I don't have to run right now, so if anybody wants to stick around and has a burning question that you couldn't wait, I know I'm happy to stick around for a little bit. But it was really wonderful to see you all. Thank you for investing in this work that I know we think is really, really important for all of us. All right, take care.